Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to Computer Science for Humans. Today, we are doing an internet classic, and we are going to make a tier list. Wait, wrong side. This side, this side. You see it, it's behind me. Specifically, we are doing a tier list of the easiest languages to learn as your first language in programming. If you're new to programming and looking for the best place to start, this is a great place to start. I have two goals today. First, if you are new to programming, I hope to give you a great starting point so you can have the information you need to start learning programming and know that you're making at least a decent choice in what language you want to learn. If you're a more experienced developer, then my goal here today is to give you something to argue with me about in the comments. I am joking about that, but seriously, if you disagree with anything or everything I say today, please do let me know in the comments. Also, before we begin, do remember all of this is just my opinion. And if you disagree with me, you are objectively wrong, but that's okay. It's so hard to say that with a straight face. Wait, don't type yet. You gotta wait till I'm actually saying things that you can disagree with. More seriously though, there are a lot of asterisks to this whole thing. Tier lists as a whole, they're fun, but they are not the end all be all of answers. And at the end of the day, each language does serve usually a specific purpose, and you should really learn them all, or at least a lot of them, because there are a lot of programming languages. So without further ado, let's rank the top 20 programming languages in the world in terms of which ones are the easiest to learn for a beginner. First off, we have Cobol, which is this little Triceratops thing. Cobol is one of those languages that's been around for a very long time, and I was actually really surprised to see this here. Also, it's worth noting that the languages I have in this list are actually taken from Taibi.com, I think. The 20 most used languages in the world. Not necessarily the most lines of code written, but the languages that are used the most in career settings. So these are the 20 most frequently used in job listings of all the languages. Also, they are not sorted in that order down below, just so you know. So we're gonna start with Cobol, and it's worth mentioning in this too, I'm not omniscient. I know it's kind of hard to believe, but I don't know everything. So if I get anything wrong, please let me know in the comments. And I'm kind of just going off of the vibes of the language, or if I have firsthand experience writing in the language, I'm obviously going off of that. So I'm just putting it here while we talk about it. Cobol is a weird language. I don't have firsthand experience with this one, so feel free to correct me or argue with me in the comments on this one especially. But Cobol, from what I understand and from the code I've seen of it, it's not a low-level language. I thought it was more of an assembly-ish language, kind of like Fortran, which I think is on this list somewhere too. It's technically a high-level language, but if you look at the code, it kind of strikes me as a hybrid between what I would consider a normal language like Java, C, and things in that family, or even Python. A hybrid of that with some of the syntax ideas of SQL, which, as you may have noticed, is also on this list. We'll get to that later. Doing some research on it for this video, I'm actually kind of curious, so I'll probably look into it more. For now, I'm going to put it in harder than it seems, because it strikes me as the kind of language that has a lot of hidden pitfalls and maybe some complex topics behind the curtain. But if you're experienced in Cobol, please feel free to wax eloquent in the comments below about how amazing it is, or how horrible it is. My main experience with Cobol is my professor in college was a Cobol programmer for a long time. And so I mostly am going off of his stories and examples of code that I've seen. I would be willing to bump it up to easy to learn potentially, because it doesn't look that hard. One of the pros to learning Cobol is it really seems like the syntax is closer to regular English. So you'll be typing stuff that's closer to the way you would say it, for example. But it also uses all caps a lot, kind of like SQL, which I think is just weird. I'm not a huge fan of that, but its similarity to English should make it fairly easy to learn. I'm gonna put it in harder than it seems because I'm not actually convinced that it is particularly easy, but I'll need to do more research on it to learn it. Next we have, is this Kotlin? This is like a weird, let me double check I'm not crazy. Kotlin is basically like TypeScript for Java. I put your pitchforks down. No, wait, seriously, let me cook. But seriously, Kotlin is essentially an extension of Java, although it is a standalone language in and of its own right. But it has a lot of the bonuses and detriments of Java built into it because it runs on the Java virtual machine and is essentially an extension of, or a modification of, the Java syntax. If you like Java, I would highly recommend trying Kotlin and seeing if you like that as well. I would put it in a similar category. It might be a little easier to learn, but I think that's going to be largely preference-based. I'm going to put that in harder than it seems because my experience with it has been very mixed. Because if you're a beginner, Kotlin has a lot of the learning difficulties that come with Java, but then the change in syntax is potentially a pretty big hiccup. So I'm going to put this in hard to learn as well. For now, I'm going to put it behind Cobol, but I feel like they're about even. And next, we have Ada. So with this one, I'm going to be real with you guys. I have never used or even looked at a line of Ada before this video. So take what I'm about to say with a lot of salt, but I've looked at some of the code and things like that, and it seems like an okay language. To my mind, I feel like if you're new, Ada might be a little bit overwhelming. It looks like it uses a lot of kind of mathematical notation almost. And so if you're more of a mathematically minded person, you might actually really like it. If you're more of a not mathematically minded person, I suspect Ada would be tricky to learn. The syntax of Ada looks like it's mostly white space based, which is usually nice for making it easy to learn. But again, they just use a lot of more unique symbols rather than words, which can make it a lot harder to pick up, especially if you're not mathematically inclined. And looking into the history of this language, it was actually made by the Department of Defense in order to help people write very maintainable code that is very unlikely to have a bad error, as you might imagine is useful on things like missiles that explode. So even the purpose for which Ada was designed is a bit more complex. Its main benefits are it's good at concurrency, which is something a beginner programmer probably does not want to deal with. I know I wouldn't when I was starting out. I still don't like dealing with concurrency. It's just part of life. And then error handling, which is also something you really don't want to deal much with when you are first starting out programming. So I'm going to put Ada in not for the faint of heart. And again, remember, this is specifically in the context of learning your first programming language. Okay, so next up we have assembly. I think this is assembly. Yes. This is assembly. This goes right into Fly You Fools. I don't know why anybody in the modern day would start with assembly. The only reason to start with assembly is if you really enjoy going through life on hard mode. If you don't know, assembly is basically binary, but with words. Assembly language is extremely difficult to learn, and in some cases, depending on which assembly language you learn, I know this is specifically assembly language, but there are a lot of languages that I would qualify as assembly languages, and learning any of those is, it's hard if you already know programming. If you don't know programming already, then it's crazy difficult. I just do not recommend starting on assembly. And most programmers, if you're new to programming and wanting to start programming, honestly, the likelihood that you will ever need to learn assembly language at all for any reason is extremely low. The only two scenarios I would recommend learning assembly language is if, well, three scenarios, I guess. One, if it just sounds super awesome and you want to do it, that's totally fine. Two, if for whatever reason you're in a job that requires you to learn it, then fair enough, I guess. And three, if you're the kind of person who's already built a computer in Minecraft using redstone, you're probably fine to do assembly. But if you're a regular person looking to code just so you can get a job or because it's fun, I really just don't recommend starting with assembly. It's just not worth the effort. Oh, another reason to learn it would be if you really want to understand the nitty-gritty details of how programming languages work at the lowest level. So if you want to understand how the computer decides which things to put where in memory, if you want to know how the sausage is made, look no further than assembly. Otherwise, don't bother. Certainly not as your first language. Okay, next we have R. R is a weird language. It is kind of designed around statistics, and the idea is it is for showing statistics and handling statistics calculations and stuff in a very efficient way. I don't have a lot of first-hand experience with R. I'm kind of moderately familiar with it. So correct me if I'm wrong about any of this below, but it is first and foremost a statistics-based language. So if you're doing something related to statistics, then R could be absolutely perfect for you. But for everybody else, I'm gonna put it in not for the faint of heart. Ada is probably a better starting language because it's more of a normal programming language. R is just, it's just weird and it's just not worth it. You don't have to, I wouldn't say run away from it like I would with assembly, but, and it's an okay first language to learn, but it's not gonna be the best experience. So next up, we have MatLab. If you're an engineer, you know MatLab very, very well. If you're not an engineer, just don't bother. This is a language designed for engineers by engineers in order to help them do the various equations and whatnot that they need to do for their job. I'm gonna put this in Fly You Fools. It's better than assembly. If you want to learn it, it is still a programming language. It is still useful potentially if you're doing lots of math and stuff. And I'm sure there's all sorts of other stuff it can do too. But again, it was made for engineers by engineers to make engineering easier. If you're not an engineer, don't bother. If you are an engineer, then you're probably gonna learn it anyway. So next we have Rust. I have such mixed feelings about Rust. On paper, it is a really cool language and it has my favorite compiler I have ever interact with in my entire life. The compiler practically teaches the language to you itself, which is really cool. There's a caveat though, and that is if you don't already know another programming language, I personally think Rust is actually really difficult to use. You have to deal with pointers in Rust, and there are kind of two different ways that they're used. I'm not really gonna get into it because I don't have a fantastic understanding of exactly how Rust handles that stuff. I've kind of dabbled in it. I'm gonna say Rust is not for the faint of heart. It's probably better than Ada, and its compiler is fantastic. But the language itself is pretty complex, so I just don't think it's worth it for a newbie. PHP. Now this one might be a little controversial because PHP is actually pretty widely used. I mean, obviously it's one of the 20 most used languages in the world, and it's kind of like a counterpart to JavaScript. I don't know if they're like direct competitors per se, but they both do a similar thing, which is add some kind of actual code to a web page. And as a side note, I think you can do stuff like that with Rust as well. I think it was partially built with that in mind. Like I know you can do Rust websites, but back to PHP. My issue with PHP is it's not JavaScript. Honestly, as far as ease of learning goes, it's gotten a lot better over the years, and it's way better now than it used to be. And there's probably a good argument that it's actually fairly easy now. I haven't used it in recent years, but I just don't see a good reason to use PHP instead of JavaScript for learning, unless like your job requires it or something like that. But like if C, which we haven't gotten to yet because it kind of shuffled them when I put the pictures up, so I'm sure we'll talk more about this later. But it's kind of like if someone used C a lot and then was like, it would be cool the internet had C, but then they only kind of put C up there. I don't know, it's weird. I don't recommend it. I think it's not for the faint of heart. It's still better than Assembly or MatLab. MatLab again for non-engineers. I might put it ahead of R just because R is more of a niche language. I don't recommend learning PHP unless you have a specific reason for it. And I personally do not like the language at all. What was that one? Scratch. So next up we have Scratch. You probably can't read that because it pixelated when I uploaded the image, but is what it is. It's Scratch. This is an interesting one. This is a language designed to teach beginners. But the weird thing is that this is just fascinating to me. You kind of like drag and drop chunks of code onto a screen, almost like make a flow chart or like a diagram of sorts of your code. It's a really interesting idea. And it's actually a lot like blueprint programming with Unreal Engine, or I know a lot of other game engines have started using that. And it was specifically designed with the intent of teaching new developers. I think this is an absolutely fantastic way to learn programming. You're gonna learn all the concepts, but don't have to worry about weird mathematical notation for the most part. Now, if you've used Scratch and have some reason to dislike it, let me know in the comments below. I suspect that it's one of the easiest languages to learn, and this is definitely going in the my grandma could learn it, because it's kind of built for that. It is kind of marketed for kids, because kids are beginners at everything they're doing. But seriously, this is not just for kids. Go try Scratch out if you haven't. I don't actually know if it's free, so that might be a little bit of a bummer. But if you're new to programming and you don't know for sure that you're gonna just totally go headfirst into it, or you just want a simpler context where you can make programs, learn how the logic flow works, which is honestly one of the hardest things to do, is learning how to think like a computer. This is a great way to learn how to think like a computer and get an idea for how programming works without having to worry about typing a bunch of weird mathematical symbols or anything like that. Absolutely, Scratch is amazing for learning a first language. Next, we have Fortran. So I think Fortran is really cool, and I would never recommend it to a beginner. It's a very old language. It's actually one of the first languages, and its whole thing is that you can be super efficient with it, especially with mathematical calculations, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, the whole purpose of Fortran is do math fast. It is not an easy language to learn, in my humble opinion. There is lots, it's built for math. So if you're mathematically minded, it might be great. If you're not mathematically minded, it might be an absolute nightmare. Also, it gets mega negative points from me for using the word subroutine instead of function or something like that. Maybe there's a technical difference that it likes to harp on or something. I'm a firm believer that for people learning, the closer, actually for anyone, programming languages should be as close to English as humanly possible, as computerly possible, as possible. The farther it is from English, or whatever language you speak, whatever. I'm in America, so it's English. The farther it is from English, the farther it is from our cultural context of how we understand the world. Fortran is very far from English. There's English words in there, but they're all really weird ones like subroutine, and there's English in there, but it's not like everyday English, which puts Fortran in a very low fly you fools. I do not recommend it as a starting language unless, again, you like to live on the edge or you like hard mode. Better than assembly, less niche than MATLAB. You know what though? I'm gonna say not for the faint of heart, and I'm gonna move R down. R is just, it's kind of with MATLAB where it's very niche, and it's just, I would not recommend learning on R. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. It's gonna replace that. So it's not for the faint of heart. You could learn on Fortran. I don't recommend it at all. Although I still think I actually want to put it above PHP. PHP's awful, man. It's just awful. And actually, another complication with PHP is you have to learn, you can't just learn PHP and use it by itself, not really. Maybe it works standalone, but it's built for use as part of the internet, so you have to understand internet stuff as well. And that's just an extra complication that, in hindsight, I think PHP is gonna go down here. Just don't bother with PHP. Just don't. It's not worth it. Unless you have a specific reason to. But as your first language, no. Okay, so what is this one? I'm gonna Google this one. This one is only here because it was in the top 20 list. I had never heard of it until now. I'd heard of Pascal, but I've never heard of the Delphi object Pascal. And since the top 20 list saw fit to differentiate between Pascal and Delphi object Pascal, here we are. So this is another kind of weird one. It seems like it has a lot of tools for maybe drag and dropping stuff. I've never used this one, but it is going below assembly for one simple reason, and that is it is proprietary. So if you're a brand new programmer, you almost certainly cannot afford the price it would take to really use this software. So it's not meant for you if you're a new programmer. It's meant for, honestly, probably a big corporation that runs on really old code. And it seems like it might be cool, but I can't recommend this to anybody. It may be hard, it may be easy, but it's proprietary, so you have to buy it. It's not worth it. There's so many things you could do better. Okay, Visual Basic. So this is one I, again, have kind of mixed feelings about. I've heard a lot of people say that they really like it, which is baffling to me because I'm pretty sure it's a low-level language. For a long time, I thought that Visual Basic was literally like maybe a step above assembly, but I was wrong. I Googled it just to double check that I'm not crazy. For the longest time, I don't know why, but for some reason, for the longest time, I thought this was close to an assembly language. And it is not. I've not used this personally myself. I'm only passingly familiar with it. So again, argue with me in the comments below, but it loses some points for me on learnability for a few reasons. The first kind of negative, and this is a bit smaller, it uses kind of Java-ish syntax for a lot of things. Emphasis on ish, don't get too mad yet, I'll clarify. But you've got a lot of more mathematical notation for things, and you're gonna be interacting with a lot of non-English symbols. And that is going to make it harder to learn. It also loses some points for me for using the word subroutine instead of function. Yes, they are both kind of mathematical terms, and maybe subroutine, you know, maybe there's an argument to use subroutine instead. But to me, subroutine sounds esoteric. Functions sounds like math. And math is less esoteric than subroutine, in my opinion. Let me know in the comments below what you think. I think subroutine it's also harder to say. I don't know. I do not like using the word subroutine. It loses further points because the keywords are truncated. Instead of saying subroutine, it says sub, which if you're brand new, that might seem like subtract, it might seem like substitute. There are so many words that start with sub. A language is harder to learn the less like English it is. And the more you shorten things, the more non-English it gets. Imagine the stereotype of corporate speak where, you know, everyone talks to each other in acronyms and kind of like company slang. And if you're not from that company, you really just don't know what they're talking about. Jargon, that's the word, jargon. The more that way a language is, the more you have to be inundated in it to understand it. And I just think Visual Basic, on some levels, it is more English-like than, say, Java, which we actually, Java even on here? Is Java not, okay. Oh no, there it is. I was gonna say, there's no way Java's not one of the top used languages. That would be amazing to me, which Python apparently passed it, but that's a whole other thing. That's amazing to me as well. That's probably a topic for another video. But Visual Basic, one thing that I think is potentially a pro, potentially a con, depending on your exact opinion, it doesn't use curly braces. So if you have a while, instead of starting it with a curly brace and ending it with a curly brace, which is again more Java-ish or C-ish, I guess, they do while or begin while and end while. That's potentially nice. I think that has some real benefits. But I think overall, the way it looks, it's kind of a weird mishmash of very programming language looking mixed with English. And I feel like you really just kind of need to go with one or the other. I just would not recommend Visual Basic. It's not the worst. I would put it in harder than it seems, probably behind Kotlin or Cobol. Yeah, I'd probably put it behind these. You could do it, but there are better choices. Okay, SQL. Hold on. SQL gets its own new category. I hate SQL. I hate it. I hate it. What's ironic is it's more English-like in some ways than any other language on this list. Cobol might come close actually, but SQL, I hate SQL. That's it, end of story. No. So there is exactly one reason, in my opinion, to learn SQL as a beginner. And that is because a lot of people use it. That is it. For its time, it was really good. Here's my issue with SQL for beginners. It is written like English, but you use English in a completely non-English way. And so it's kind of in this uncanny valley sort of effect where it looks like it should be easy to understand and then it's not. And that, in my opinion, makes it way worse than most other things. I would be happy if nobody ever used SQL again and we just switched to either non-relational databases, or if you really need your relational databases, some other language. From what I understand of what's going on under the hood, it's very effective and quick at finding, very optimized, that's the word I'm looking for. It's very optimized for searching databases, relational databases. But man, it is not fun to use, and the compiler's horrible, and if you can avoid needing SQL, I would avoid it. Now, if you're an experienced programmer, which we're not talking about that right now, but if you are an experienced programmer, then you probably need to learn it. But if you're just starting out, I would ignore SQL as long as possible, man. I don't think I've ever met someone who loves SQL, except, no, that's not true. Occasionally I'll meet someone who loves SQL. Another problem with SQL, by the way, is there's like 5 different versions. I'm just making that number up, but there's at least 3 different versions of it that are very subtly different, and they seem the same, and then they're not in certain very important ways. And trying to figure out the difference is just awful. And I feel like when there's an error, SQL tells you to read the instruction manual. It's 2025. Have the compiler tell me what went wrong. Okay, I think I'm going to end the rant there. I could go on. I hate SQL as a language. I think it's atrocious. No disrespect to the people who made it. And at the time it was made, it was great. A fantastic tool. I don't like it. All that to say, if you are new, if you think you're going to be around people using relational databases, SQL might be necessary. So you might have to. If you don't have to learn SQL, I would postpone it until you're really familiar with an actual programming language. That's another thing. SQL is not actually a programming language. It's a database searching language. Actually, let me know in the comments if you know if it's Turing complete, because if so, I'll eat my words on that. But for all intents and purposes, it is not a programming language. It gets its own new tier. Okay, rant over. I'm actually gonna reorganize. Okay, I reorganized these a little bit to, I think, make them more interesting to talk about. I probably should have had C be one of the first languages, because it is probably the #1 learn on this language that anybody ever encounters. Almost every college course uses either C or a variation or child of C in order to teach you programming. And there are good reasons for that, and we'll get into that. Okay. C. C is like the piano of programming languages. Not necessarily easy to learn, but once you learn it, it makes it a lot easier to learn other languages. Because in order to learn C, you have to learn the fundamentals of programming. You can't kind of just skate by and just get the general idea and go. C will punish you for that whenever it gets the chance. You have to deal with pointers and direct memory references and stuff like that. You can actually overflow your memory, and I think it's gotten a lot better over the years, but it is possible to kind of hurt your computer if you write a bad enough C program. You could accidentally write a virus, essentially, that goes outside of the program and rewrites certain parts of memory. C is actually fantastic for learning programming, but it is not easy. And I'm going to put it in not for the faint of heart, but it's going to be at the very top of it. So if you learn C, you shouldn't have much trouble with R. You shouldn't have much trouble with any of these, honestly, even JavaScript. And I think if you learn C, you're probably set for Python too. But this is not about which language is best to start with per se. This is about which one is easiest to start with. C is not easy. It is potentially worth the work. Next, we've got Java. Java is one of the successors to C, and it uses a lot of the concepts that C had and then extends on them. Technically C++, we'll get to that in a second. But it is in the C family of languages, and one of the main benefits to Java as a learning language is, like C, you learn a lot of the basics about programming and you learn a lot about organizing your code. One of the big detriments to Java as a first language is that there is a lot of overhead that you have to write. And by overhead, I mean extra code you have to write in order to get to the part where you write your code, which is a subject of consternation for many, many programmers. And it's why I think Java's one of the least popular, most popular language. It's weird. I digress. The point is, Java is easier than C. You don't have to worry about pointers so much. It still comes up occasionally, but you don't really have to worry about it that much. And I think personally the syntax is much easier, partially just because you don't have to worry about pointers, but then you've got all that overhead. So I'm gonna put it in harder than it seems. I think it's not for the faint of heart. Anyone can learn Java. You do have to be a little special to learn C first. I'm kind of joking about that, but it's definitely tougher. Java, I'm going to put in front of Kotlin for sure, because Kotlin's just Java with different syntax. And I think Kotlin's a little more confusing, although again, feel free to argue with me in the comments. I don't know if it's easier or harder than Cobol. I'm going to put it in front of Cobol. Feel free to prove me wrong in the comments below as well, because that's one I'm not entirely certain of. I would probably put these about the same. So it's harder than it seems, but it's not bad. So now C#. C# is what happened when Microsoft, who makes C, saw Java, got jealous, and wanted to do that, but like still C. And then C# happened. C# is almost identical to Java, but I'm gonna put it in easy to learn because in my opinion, it's actually much easier than Java. It removes a lot of the extra overhead, and it also has some really nice syntax changes from Java that make certain things easier to do, like dictionaries are way easier in C# than in Java, just as an example. And so I think it bumps it up to easy to learn. One potential detriment about C# is Visual Studio is one of the worst IDEs in the world. While also being kind of really good, it's also just kind of really bad. It's just bizarre. Visual Studio Code is awesome. Visual Studio is kind of terrible. So because of Visual Studio, I think I am gonna bump C# back down to harder than it seems, because the language itself is great, but the development environment is kind of just, it's not great unless you get add-ons to it that make it better. ReSharper would push this up to easy to learn. So next we have Go. Go has been described by some people, particularly the Primogen, as the most mid language of all time. And I'm inclined to mostly agree with that. It is also in the C family of languages. I feel like the vibe of Go is like, what if C, but without all that stuff that's really hard and confusing. I've used Go professionally and it's fine. It's a little confusing, you have to deal with pointers, but it's easier than C for sure. I would put Go ahead of Kotlin, probably about even with Cobol and Java. It's kind of a choose your poison scenario where it's like, they've all got pros and cons, but they're kind of equally easy / hard to use or to learn. And it has the benefits as well that if you do learn Go as your first language, you're pretty well set up for just about any other language. And if you hate object-oriented programming, then this probably bumps up to easy to learn. I'm gonna put it around Java and Cobol. So next we have C++, which I'm just gonna hold here since this line is getting pretty big. C++ is what happened when people were using C and they're like, you know what? We're all extending C to also do all these things over here. What if we just build those in? And thus C++ was born. C++ is basically C with a bunch of extra code that you can pull in relatively easily. And also the ability to change what different symbols mean, which I've heard called monkey patching before. I'm not a huge fan of it. It can be really nice sometimes, but C++ it's in a weird place. Because on one hand, they have a bunch of tools in C++ that make it a lot easier to use than C. On the other hand, it still is kind of just C with some fancy extra stuff. And sometimes the fancy stuff can get really complex and out of hand and actually make everything more difficult. For example, you can tell the plus operator to, instead of adding two things together, you can make it subtract them. And maybe you have a reason to do that. That seems like a bizarre example, but maybe you have a reason to do that in your code. But if someone else comes along and works on your code, or if you're that someone else, and you try to plus things together and it keeps subtracting them instead or dividing them or something, you're gonna be like, what is going on? So C++ is, I think, not for the faint of heart. And I'm actually going to put it behind C. I used to think it was a little bit better than C for learning, but I have been convinced by some of my friends who are very proficient in C and C++, like really, really good at it, that it is actually kind of sometimes a nightmare, and C is often easier. But the standard library of C++ is really nice and convenient to have. So they're pretty comparable, to be honest. It's kind of a preference thing. Okay, we are coming toward the end. JavaScript. So JavaScript is the language the internet is built on. And it's all of these are kind of in a weird place, to be honest. It's a lot of weird languages now that I think about it, but each one was made for a particular purpose at a particular time. So JavaScript in particular, I think is one of the easiest languages to learn in the world, and it's either easy to learn or my grandma could learn it. I don't think it's my grandma could learn it. Now she could if she wanted to, but it certainly doesn't compete with Scratch for ease of learning. But it is easy to learn because it doesn't care. You can make just about any mistake in JavaScript and it's going to be fine. You're not going to hurt your computer. You're probably not going to cause a memory overflow or anything like that. And because it's often used with web pages, you frequently get immediate feedback. When you want to do more complex stuff, that's when JavaScript starts to get really wonky. And if you can look up on YouTube, there are all sorts of videos of people doing stupid stuff with JavaScript and JavaScript being like, yeah, sure, I'll make it work. Like, what is it? I think an empty array equals 0 or something there's something like that. There's lots of weird math stuff and memory related stuff with JavaScript. It's a very quirky language. I tell people it's basically a giant ball of duct tape that every time someone's like, it'd be nice if we could do this, they just duct tape it on. And it is basically held together by duct tape. But especially when you're first starting out, that doesn't really affect you that much. And I think it's a very easy language to pick up. And I think that the proof of that is in the pudding, as they say, because I think it has the most new users of pretty much any language on the planet. And it has the added benefit of being useful regardless of what you do, because the internet's around. It's kind of everywhere. So JavaScript is a really easy to learn language. It's not very strict about syntax. It doesn't really care about types. You can dig yourself into a hole, but you can kind of do that in any language. So for a beginner, if it's your first language and you just want something easy, JavaScript is a great place to start. And the last one, Python. This is going to go just to the left of JavaScript. Python has a lot of the ease of use of JavaScript. There's not a lot of funny characters. It's very English-like, not a lot of weird symbols. And JavaScript does have a lot of weird symbols in it from math, but it's less strict about where they can be used and how they can be used, so it kind of evens out a little bit. What's cool about Python is it does a lot of the work for you. And so you can actually learn Python really easily. Their documentation is really good, and there's a lot of built-in stuff that's just super smooth and easy to use. With really, really complex topics, their lack of strict typing is potentially a hindrance. You might run into some weird errors, but for the most part, especially when you're first learning, Python's fantastic. It's a really good blend of the structure of something like C or Java. Well, more Java, I guess, than C. C is you kind of build your own structure, literally. And the freedom of something like JavaScript, which, by the way, if you don't know, those are not related in any way. JavaScript was, as I understand it, called that in order to draw people's attention because Java was popular. But yeah, Python, super easy language to learn. You're going to be hard pressed to find an easier one to learn because it's almost like writing in English. And because it uses white space to delineate different sections of code and stuff like that, instead of using symbols like semicolons or curly brackets, it looks a lot like English. It's just easier to use. So yeah, that's our tier list. These are, in my opinion, of the 20 most used languages in the world, these are the ones that are easiest to use, or least easiest to use. This is how I would rank them in terms of ease of use. Let me know in the comments below if you agree or disagree with anything on here or anything I said, or if I'm just way off base with any of the languages I talked about. If I'm wrong, I would like to know that. Don't forget to press the YouTube buttons down below if you enjoyed this video and if you want to see more stuff like it. And let me know if there are any other tier lists or any other kind of content you'd be interested in seeing. I have really enjoyed this. I hope you have too. I can't wait to see you in the next video, and until that time, I'll see you later.